So let's talk about developmental norms. So a norm group consists of a sample of examinees who are representative of the population for whom your test is intended. So their goal is to provide a frame of reference. So for example, let us consider a word knowledge test that's designed to be used on, say, first-year college students. In this case, the performance on a large, heterogeneous nationwide sample of, I cannot read that. In this case, the performance of a large, heterogeneous nationwide sampling of such persons might be collected for the purposes of standardization. Because knowing what your raw score is not super helpful without some kind of reference. And this element here, just selecting a norm group and the whole idea behind it, is an essential objective of standardization. It's to determine the distribution of raw scores in a norm group so that the test developer can publish derived scores. These derived scores are norms. Norms come in a variety of examples, including percentile ranks, age equivalents, grade equivalents, standard scores, all of them. So in general, norms indicate an examinee's standing on the test relative to the performance of other persons of the same age, grade, sex, and so on. It's really important to know what your reference group is. So, for example, I know a lot of you guys are thinking about the GRE or have already taken it, and you may be slightly dismayed that your percentile is lower than it was for the SAT or your state standardized subject test. And that's to be expected because the reference group is changing. For example, in the GRE, your reference group are other graduate school bound applicants, primarily PhD applicants, as well as some master's students. So your performance is relative to that group, not relative to the entire college population, because the only people who are taking this test are those that are going to need to use it. And that's not everybody. Some schools do require that you pass a subject test, but even then, have to remember who your comparison group is. Well, for the SAT and the ACT, it's college-bound high school students, which is different from population of high school students, and so on and so forth. So always know what your reference group is, because that will be very helpful in in evaluating your relative performance. So to be effective, norms have to be obtained with great care and constructed according to well-known precepts. And we'll discuss a couple of these. Norms can be made obsolete in just a few years, so often test companies have to renorm their tests, and that's actually why tests tend to be pretty expensive. Now, we'll talk about how you can select different kinds of groups depending on what you're interested in. So you can look at developmental norms if you want to make comparisons based on individuals at that same developmental stage. You can also do age and grade norms. You create a sample that you've carefully constructed that are comparable to a reference group. These are all your comparison group. There are also local and subgroup norms, and so seeing how people perform relative to the population versus their local area, those can be different. And we'll talk a little about expectancy tables at the end of this module. Developmental norms. Developmental norms. So this is one method to attach meaning to a test. So it's a way to kind of see how far along a respondent is on the normal and typical developmental path. These tend to be intuitively appealing and a bit psychometrically crude. They tend to be harder to use in statistics and research because they're not always the best at stuff. And these include mental age, grade equivalents, developmental milestones. The idea here is that you're looking for developmental regularities, including chronological periods and invariant sequences of events that unfold in a very predictable way, and that certain behaviors allow for the use of that developmental level to be obtained as a frame of reference for interpretation of test scores. These are often ordinal scales based on developmental stages, which in turn are derived from gathering data on typical performance of individuals who are at various points within the sequence. Now, developmental norms as a term is applied really broadly, and this can be based on any trait, ability, skill, or other characteristic that's presumed to develop or deteriorate or otherwise be affected by chronological age, school grade, or stage of life. There's an implicit assumption that changes to be like that these whatever you're trying to measure change with age and development. So we don't use developmental norms on like trees, or actually we do, to like see how much growth they're having. It's a terrible example. I'm just gonna cut this. Cool. Hey folks. So I'm going to dive right in because I took a break in the middle of recording last time, and you've noticed I've changed my jacket. So yeah, enjoy. So mental age. So mental age was popularized by the Binet-Simon scale, and the idea was to have that a child's score on a test corresponded to the highest year level they could successfully complete. Now, in practice, this was a bit more challenging to implement, especially because mental age doesn't remain constant with chronological age, but their solution was to calculate basal age. And basal age is essentially this idea that it's the highest test grade level or age level that you can complete, that a subject can complete, where they pass all the tests. And so so if you get a test where you fail everything, obviously you're not at that grade level, and so you plop them down. So you could give partial credit for months, but let me actually read the script of what I wrote here, because it's better than the stream of consciousness you just heard. Okay, so ever since the introduction of the Stanford-Binet scale in the United States at the dawn of the 20th century, the idea of identifying mental age of a test taker has had some really intuitive appeal. So the idea is that the child of any chronological age who could perform on a valid test of intellectual ability, and that performance would could indicate that they had the intellectual ability of closer to like the average child of a different age group. And that would be just the idea. So let me turn that into English. So the child of any chronological age whose performance on a valid test of intellectual ability indicated that they had an intellectual ability similar to that of the average child of some other age was said to have the mental age of the norm group in which that score fell. And this is here, the idea here is that children with the same mental age, regardless of chronological age, could be expected to read at the same level of material, solve the same kinds of problems, have similar levels of reasoning, and so on and so forth. Now, we tended to get increasing in sophistication in how we thought about mental age, and because of that, and the many limitations of mental age, has led to this reluctance and general hesitancy for test results to be described in terms of mental age. Because essentially the problem with mental age as a way to report test results is it's too broad and it's inappropriately generalized. So, for example, consider a case of a 6-year-old who, according to tests, performs like a 12-year-old intellectually. So regardless of how, similar they are on their standardized testing, a 6-year-old is not going to be as similar to a 12-year-old socially, psychologically, and really in lots of other aspects outside of test performance. I've had the experience of teaching profoundly gifted kids. I did it in grad school for a couple of summers. And so while their test performance was comparable to, the average senior in college or in high school, essentially in order to get into this program, you had to score, I think, above average, maybe even above, maybe like 600 or 700 on the SAT in the math section. So you had to do really well as a kid. And so in theory, using this logic, I could have treated them like college students. You don't treat middle schoolers like college students, let me tell you, because, oh boy, they may have been intellectually gifted, but they were still middle schoolers with all the heartache of that. And so, yeah, you can't assume that just because they can perform well on tests, that they've acquired all the other skills that a typical high school senior has acquired just by living and interacting with their peers. So, in some ways, mental age is great, but it obviously has some technical difficulties and overgeneralizations. Now, kind of the logical extension of this are age-based norms, which pretty much are the same thing, but we don't tend to generalize them in the same way. So the idea with age norms, these are also called age equivalence scores. These age norms indicate the average performance of different samples of test takers who were at various ages at the time the test was administered. So height's a really classic example of this because it's pretty not controversial. The idea is that scores, in this case heights, for kids will gradually increase at various rates as a function of age until, you're a teenager, etc. You tend to not shrink until we get way at the other end of the spectrum, which is also where a lot of psychological test batteries are. Because there's a ton of interest in my notes I have, it is the graying of the American public. But anyway, so where you're interested in seeing how those same kind of cognitive scores, those neuropsychological tests, perform as a function of advanced age. Now, carefully constructed age norm tables for physical characteristics such as height enjoy widespread acceptance, and they're really not controversial. However, this is not the case for age-based norms for psychological characteristics such as intelligence. So while you'll hear that the average IQ is 100, that's by design. They force the data to be 100 at every age to make it relative to the average in that sample, because there's such controversy around what are norms for typical ages. All right. So let's talk a little about grade equivalents. These are similar to mental age, but instead of age, grade is used. And so we'll go through some examples of this in a bit, but I want to talk a little more about what they are first. So they're designed to indicate the average test performance of a test taker in a given school grade. These grade-based norms are developed by administering tests to representative samples of children over a range of consecutive grade levels, such as like 1st through 6th grade. Next, just so that we're all on the same page, next, like the mean and median scores, those summary statistics for kids at each grade are calculated. And now, because school years typically run from September to June, so it's 10 months. So fractions work really well here. So for decimals. So that's like, for example, a 6th grader performing exactly at the average of a graded norm test administered during the 4th month of a school year, so like December, would achieve the grade equivalent score of a 6.4. So like grade age norms, grade norms have that grade intuitive appeal. Kids learn, but here's the reality of the situation. Kids learn and develop at varying rates. But, they are a bit predictable, and so perhaps because of this fact, grade norms have wide applications, especially in elementary school, where there's less differentiation. Now consider the case of a kid in the 12th grade who scores a 6 on grade norm spelling tests. Does this mean that the student has the same spelling ability as the average 6th grader? No. What the finding says, though, is that this student and a hypothetically average 6th grader answered the same fraction of questions correctly. Grade norms don't provide information as to the content or types of items that a student could or could not answer correctly. So, while they're convenient, they and are readily understandable, they're not as helpful as we would like. Because while they're useful with respect to years and months, they really don't have much application to kids who are not yet in school, kids who are out of school, and also they're not designed for adults at all who have returned to school, or really adults outside of school. Now, in terms of interpretation, I've zipped through these, but I spelled out a couple here. So, so interpretation of the 3 I've got on the slides. So, a 4.0 is the average performance of a 4th grader at the start of the school year, while 4.5 is at the 6-month mark, is at the 5-month mark, so about halfway through the school year. 4.9 is almost done. We're a month away. It's May. Now, in terms of misinterpretation, so someone who gets a 6.9 or 4.9 doesn't mean that someone has mastered all the math, for example, taught in 6th grade. Rather, they performed relatively better compared to others in their grade. So, don't assume that student is ready for, let me reread my example. Say you have a 4th grader who performs as a percentage of getting correct at the 6.9 math level. That doesn't mean that they're ready for 7th grade. That just means that they performed way, way better relative to other 4th graders. It's like a Z-score. Sorry, I'm gonna keep making these weird motions. Cool. Okay, so just ordinal scales in general. We're almost done. More talking. Ordinal scales are approach based on developmental research. They tend to describe behavior that's typical at successive ages. And these are sequential patterns. These are way easier to map out in early development, like with babies and stuff. And the idea is that you have these steps in that constant order. And this entire setup presupposes mastery from previous stages. And typically the evidence that they use here is uniform development, where everybody hits that stage, or everyone is expected to hit that stage. So, my notes are all over the place. So developmental norms tend to be applied broadly to norms developed on the basis of any trait, ability, skill, or characteristic, and these are presumed to develop or deteriorate or otherwise be affected by chronological age, school age, or some life stage. There is a stagey approach. This is a very Piagetian approach for those of you who've taken developmental. So you could develop a test based on Piaget's concept of accommodation and then norm this test based in terms of life stages written in his writings. So such developmental norms would be subject to the same sorts of limitations that other developmental norms are, especially those not applied to physical characteristics. And accommodation test norms for this Piaget would be further subjected to additional scrutiny and criticism, especially by those who don't ascribe to this theory. So there's a lot of theory here, potentially, but but the idea is that these developmental norms are supposed to be applied broadly. And this approach comes straight out of developmental research. The function here is that they're designed to identify stages reached by the child in the development of specific functions. The classic example is developmental milestones. And you can essentially give scores that are approximately age-based. And frankly, the number you assign to them is really not that important, rather than the accompanying description. So as I've shown here, there are various milestones. I'm going to upload these so you can actually zoom in. But, for the first 5 years of life, where a lot of these developmental milestones are really well documented in the United States, and actually one reason why they're super well documented is because of Public Law 94-142. Super exciting law title. But what it is in the mid-1970s, the United States Congress mandated that professional evaluation of children aged 3 and older had to be done so that special education needs could be met. And in order to do that, they needed to develop norms to evaluate the kiddos. So the US government has a ton of these norms, as we can see here. There's a ton of assessment techniques that with these milestones, but as you can see, it's very descriptive. There's not really much scoring. It's just do you meet this criteria? Okay, so that is it for this video. I'll see y'all